All right, guys, how are we doing today? I hope you're having a good day so far, and if you're not, then it's about to get a whole lot better. For this lecture, we're going to go over Module 20. Basically, what we are going to cover is we're going to talk about how the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model is used to formulate macroeconomic policy, and we're going to explain the rationale for the stabilization policies, describe the importance of fiscal policy, and identify the policies that constitute expansionary fiscal policy and those that constitute contractionary or fiscal policy. So macroeconomic policy, basically the economy is self-correcting in the long run. When we get to class, during our next class, we will look at a self-correcting aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. However, for this lesson and for the most part, the economy does not self-correct. All right, government officials get involved and they institute what's known as stabilization policies, which is the use of government policy to reduce the severity of recessions and rein in excessively strong expansions. Now, the person featured in this picture here is John Maynard Keynes. He is basically kind of the guy that made macroeconomics a legitimate policy field, and he was a strong advocate of government intervention in the economy, either during periods of great recessions or depressions like what we had in the 1930s in the United States. And also, too, if the economy got too hot and there was too much inflation, then he advocated for a reduction of government spending and an increase in taxes to pay off the debt. So we'll talk about Keynesian economics and things like that in the next module or later on in the class. But basically, that's kind of what he advocated for, is for a government to step in and stabilize the economy during different periods. So policy in the face of demand shocks. Basically, if policy were able to perfectly anticipate shifts of the aggregate demand curve, then the period of low aggregate output and falling prices could be avoided. Basically, recessions in general could be avoided. Price stability is generally regarded as a desirable goal. So it's kind of one of those things where if we could anticipate things like with the economy crashing in 2008, we could have made that a lot less worse than what it was. However, in actuality, that doesn't happen. And in the next module, we'll take a look at why that's the case specifically, but it doesn't take too much to figure that out. There are no easy policies to shift the short-run aggregate supply curve. So I want you to write down these 3 bullet points in that second box on your notes. Okay, so I'll leave that up there for a minute. You can pause it and write that down, and then I want you to write this down there as well. So there are no easy policies to shift the short-run aggregate supply curve. Part of the problem is because, like we've talked about, businesses are the ones that control the supply of goods and services. And so in order for the aggregate supply curve to shift or to change, then it's necessary for businesses to actually do stuff and make more stuff or not make as much things. So there's no way that the government can directly impact it. They can only make conditions favorable or not favorable to do certain things. So here's a little thing. You can read that on your own. But yes, stabilization policies have in general stabilized the economy where periods of recessions are not as bad and we can more quickly end inflationary periods. This gives you, now we're going to start talking about government revenue and government spending, how the government receives/spends its money. So funds flow into the government in the form of taxes and government borrowing. Anytime there's a shortfall, we call that a deficit. We're going to go into more specific details on that in a later module, but just know that that's where the government gets money to spend. The government spends money on things in the forms of purchase of goods and services, and government transfers household. So they'll buy things for the military or manage forests and things like that, and they'll also send like Social Security and other government transfers to households. So the way they get that money is they either collect it in taxes or they borrow it by selling U.S. government bonds. This shows you the sources of tax revenues. This was in 2013. This would look a little different, especially with the new income tax law. But we don't have that data yet because this is the first year of it being implemented. So I will update that when we have that. But basically, just know that personal income taxes come up with 35% of revenue. Corporate profit taxes was only 8%, and that'll probably drop even further because of the new tax law. Corporations pay even less in taxes. And social insurance taxes, that's FICA. If you have a job and you've seen money coming out for Social Security, Medicare, or FICA, then that's what that is. And then other taxes, those are going to be things like estate taxes or tariffs or anything like that is where that is going to come from. This is what we spend our money on. Again, this was in 2013, so this would look a little different. Social Security, Medicare would take up a larger percentage of it. But those are our two main things that we spend money on in terms of programs, and Medicaid as well. If we add up the total of those three, we're at about half of our government spending. We also we spend 12% on national defense, 14% on education. Other goods and services, part of this is going to pay interest on our debt, things like that. You can see over here other government transfers, 2%. So that's things like food stamps and other things like that. As you can see, that's not a huge overall percentage of our budget. Just kind of interesting because that's usually the stuff that gets talked about the most. So now, fiscal policy. Here's the official definition for it. Is the use of taxes, government transfers, or government purchases of goods and services to shift the aggregate demand curve. Now, these policies, fiscal policy is the use of taxes, government transfers, or government purchases of goods and services to shift the aggregate demand curve. Basically, government spending is going to impact the government portion of the GDP or the aggregate demand curve. The other, in terms of taxes and government transfers, are going to affect consumer spending. Expansionary fiscal policy increases the aggregate demand curve and can take one of three forms. It can either be an increase in government purchases of goods and services, it could be a cut in taxes, or it could be an increase in government transfers. Contractionary fiscal policy reduces aggregate demand and can take one of three forms, either a reduction in government purchases of goods and services, an increase in taxes, or a reduction in government transfers. Basically, these will be used, so expansionary fiscal policy is going to be used during a recession. So when the economy is not doing very well, they're going to do expansionary policy to try and grow the economy. Contractionary fiscal policy will be used during an inflationary period as a way to kind of lower the inflation rate. All right. Okay, so I will draw this for you when we get to class because my Microsoft pen that's attached to my computer is not working. I think it needs a new battery. But just know that expansionary fiscal policy is going to increase aggregate demand, so it'll shift to the right. So you could draw this you could start off drawing your aggregate demand line in a recessionary gap, and then show a shift in aggregate demand shifting to the right to close the recessionary gap and bring it into long an equilibrium. You could also, so if there's a contractionary fiscal policy, they would do that starting in an inflationary period, and then that would have a leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve to bring it into longer equilibrium there. And so the big reason why fiscal policy is not a perfect policy solution is because there are usually significant lags in its use. If you think about it, for the government to do anything, they have to get things passed through Congress and then be signed by the president. And there are difficulties in doing that. First of all, they have to realize that there's a recession or inflationary period and collect and analyze data. Then they have to develop a plan, which takes time. Then they have to get it passed through Congress, which takes time. Then they have to get the president to sign it, and then they actually have to spend the money. So, it's kind of crazy when you think about it. So, anyway, hope you all enjoyed this lecture. If I wasn't able to edit that part out of the video, then, yeah, you'll know what I'm talking about. If not, don't worry about it. Anyway, have a good rest of your day.